Hey everyone, and welcome to Feedback, episode 34. Today we're joined by musicologist Will Robin and composer slash violinist Andrew McIntosh. We're going to be talking with both of them about a bunch of works that Andrew has written for Yarnwire. We've had a really amazing bunch of years of collaboration with him. I feel very fortunate for that. And we're going to be talking about a couple of the things ranging from Hyenas in the Temples of Pleasure to percussion duo and other pieces. Don't forget, you can always send questions ahead of time to feedback@yarnwire.org. We have yet to receive an email at that email address, so please send us an email. We would love to hear from you. On the other hand, we have gotten questions in the chats, so please feel free to send us a question via Facebook chat or YouTube at any time, and we'll try and get to that during the episode if we can. We're really excited that you guys could be here with us today. So thanks for joining us. And with that, I'll pass it on over to you, Will.
Thank you so much for hosting Yarnwire, folks. I'm very excited to get a chance to talk to Andrew. I've been an admirer of his music for some time. I remember over the summer we're Facebook friends, and so I occasionally see your crap on my feed. Sorry, I should say I occasionally see your stuff on my crappy feed. And one of the things that I really enjoyed reading back in August was an essay that you wrote for Wild Up, the ensemble with which you work, which was a few months into the pandemic, about why you are interested in the wild, why you go into the wild, why you like to be out of cities and in nature. I thought maybe we could actually just start as a way of getting into your music, talking a little bit about your history of going into the wild, a term you prefer over wilderness, and maybe we can talk about that too. So maybe just start there. Tell us a little bit about how that started for you.
Oh, sure. Well, very first, I would just like to say thank you for inviting me to be here and participate in this. It's working with Yarnwire over the years has been a real highlight of my musical life. So this is nice to have everybody together. And in terms of, I have a cat creating disturbances. In terms of, I guess, going into the wild or wilderness, whatever term you use, it's been a part of my life since I was a small child, because I grew up in a rural area in northern Nevada in the desert. And I feel like having some kind of connection to open spaces is very important for me. It's part of why I've chosen to make Los Angeles my home, is because it's of the various urban centers in the US, it's one that has great access to getting outside.
At what point in your kind of musical trajectory did that become an important thing for you as a musician as well? I mean, I imagine a lot of people just, enjoy going hiking, but aren't necessarily writing pieces about the experience of being out in the woods.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm not sure I have a clear answer, because I don't necessarily think of myself as someone who writes music like about nature per se. And I think it has a strong influence on the types of experiences I'm interested in sonically.
Okay.
But I'm not sure that there's a direct link. So I guess, the music that I tend to be most happy with that I've written, I often have no clue what I'm doing. And okay. I get to the end of it and look at it and say, what did I just do? What happened? And taking that mentality and kind of looking backwards to say, well, what are the threads that connect this music that have something to do with being out in nature, out in the wild? I think the best thing I can say about it is that it's just a general sense of maybe not being in a hurry. And allowing things to take whatever space or time they need to take.
So like the temporality of like being in a space where you don't have to be thinking about what the next thing is going to be.
Yeah. And perhaps also the experience of being in a space where things move very slowly, but where circumstances are such that they allow you to observe that movement that's very slow. Yeah.
One of the pieces you're working on now, which is, I guess it's complete, right? Is Little Jimmy is now being recorded. Is that where we're at with this piece? Okay, cool. This is for Yarn Wire and not yet available for us to listen to, but hopefully soon. Involves a series of field recordings you did in the San Gabriel Mountain at a backpacker camp, which I guess was named Little Jimmy. When you go out backpacking, you are obviously bringing audio equipment with you, but like, what is that? Are you going with the intent of, I want to generate something creatively? Are you going with the intent of, let me stash this in my backpack in case something interesting happens? Like, how does that kind of work?
Yeah, well, it's a kind of a recent thing for me, actually. In fact, Little Jimmy is the first piece that I have finished ever that has used any kind of electronics or playback.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Or speakers or cables or anything in the performance. So from that perspective of not quite knowing what I'm doing, I'm not sure I've made it far enough to look backwards and speak too eloquently about exactly what role the field recording has in that piece. But in terms of where it came from, it was about a year ago when I borrowed a little field recorder from one of my colleagues at CalArts on a climbing trip, and just decided to dedicate one of the days of the climbing trip to recording south of Yosemite in the mountains, and completely fell in love with the process. It was one of the most meditative days I have experienced in my life. And
what about
so then
having the recorder makes it a more meditative? Is it like the need to just stay in one area?
Yeah, really just forces you to sit still and be quiet and listen instead of being active and moving. And so it's something I started in April, I guess. I became a bit provoked by, I think it was a podcast I was listening to, actually, where someone quoted John Muir as observing that the different species of pine can be identified by the sound the wind makes in them.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Because of the length of the needles and the how dense they are and the shape that they have. And so I've been thinking, well, one COVID safe activity is to go out to the middle of nowhere by yourself. And so I've been embarking on a little bit of a journey to attempt to record all the 18 species of pine that are native to California.
That seems like a pretty hefty undertaking. I mean, how far away, like what is the geographical spread of these pine trees?
Well, I think around 12 of them actually exist in the San Gabriel Mountains, which is just an hour or two drive away. But some of the others will take a little more effort to get to. In August, I recorded the bristlecone pines, which only live up around 11,000 feet elevation in the White Mountains. So those are a little harder to access, but still.
Yeah, I knew nothing about that until I read that huge Alex Ross article in the New Yorker about bristlecones. No, I feel like I know too much about bristlecones. Yeah, everyone should check out that article. Sorry, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, so these I still don't have a clear vision for what's going to happen with these recordings, but they've been, it's been a nice little kind of backbone to my experiences lately, and some of these different recordings are turning into different pieces. And so the one that I took near Little Jimmy, I was already planning to use that in the piece for Yarn Wire when Little Jimmy burned in the Bobcat fire.
Right.
And so at that point, the recordings kind of took on more importance in the piece. And that was when I decided to name the piece after the place. I thought it was a way of just kind of honoring that.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about, you create these recordings in this moment of, stillness and meditation, and now you are left with something that is preserving something that kind of no longer exists, right?
Yeah, it's actually happened in another piece I'm also working on from a
Oh,
different
wow.
area. And I guess the most I can say about it is that the piece is just kind of a sort of celebration of the place and the recording. It's not particularly a piece about fire or something like that. But I just tried to frame the music in such a way that it kind of honored the recording and maybe augmented it in some way.
I mean, it seems like, you know, you said you don't think of yourself as a composer who makes music about nature, but it seems like at this point, if one is to make music that involves nature, it has to be about climate change, because of, like, you didn't set out to write a piece that had to do with climate change, and that's what you ended up with simply by virtue of time passing, right?
Yes. Um, yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure. Um, yeah, I'm still thinking about what that means for this piece. I mean, fire is a natural part of the landscape in California, but the intensity of the fires is not natural that we're currently seeing. And
Right.
so, or like in the case of this particular fire, it seems it was caused by the electrical company.
Oh, wow.
That a tree hit, you know, a power line because they hadn't been maintaining it properly. And then it was 116 degrees in Los Angeles, and so the fire just burned much beyond what would happen naturally.
Wow.
But also, don't let Andrew go anywhere with the field recorder. Other lesson from this:
devastation in his wake.
Right.
Yeah. So maybe let's talk a little bit more about how this piece came together and kind of Yarnwire's role too. So, like, how did the initial seeds? I guess seeds is a good word to describe this. Like from Yarnwire's perspective, how did you end up reaching out to Andrew for this particular piece? At what point did the field recording become at the center of it?
I think you know, we had such a great experience with Andrew in 2012 with Hyenas, right? And that piece has kind of become an important piece for us, both personally with Andrew and our friendship and working method, and that we were like we were going to do an appearance at the Time Spans Festival this last summer, and I forget which came first, the date or the piece, but we were like, it would be really cool to get another piece for the quartet by Andrew. And that's kind of been a mission of ours for a number of composers, because, back a long time ago, we were like, well, string quartets have quartet number 1, quartet number 2 from the same composer. And we're like, okay, well, we should, why not? Why not have multiple pieces by the same composer, especially if they're spaced out, and so I think it was just natural. One day I called you, Andrew. I was like, hey, do you want to do a new piece? Something like that. I think I had a really bad phone connection, and we had to try multiple times. And it really just started like that. And yeah, I think we had a plan. The plan got scuttled thanks to obvious things. But we managed to record it in November, and eventually there's going to be a live performance of the premiere after we've recorded it, so kind of backwards order of things, but that was kind of the trajectory.
Yeah. Andrew, once you kind of got the commission, how did the idea for using a field recording come to be? How did you kind of end up writing a score around this recording, or writing a score and then using the recording?
Well, I generally tend to write a few pieces at the same time. I don't know if it's the most functional working method, but I tend to, work on one thing for a few weeks and then set it aside and work on something else for a few weeks. And those pieces always end up becoming kind of intertwined. And the project that I was working on at the beginning of the year is actually a fixed media project that is not quite yet finished, but that puts together some of these recordings. And I was very excited by the sounds. And it just sort of naturally worked its way into the Yarn Wire piece as well.
What kinds of things worked their way in? Like what are the material of the recording kind of gives texture to what the percussionists and pianists are doing?
Yeah, there's two things actually. One of them is a heavy prevalence of bowed piano.
Okay.
I feel very lucky to have a Bosendorfer in my office at CalArts. And so on the last day before
that's kind of crazy for a not pianist. I have a dinky ass like electric keyboard in my office.
It's a bit of a story of how it ended up there, but
okay. Is Charlemagne Palestine like leave it or something?
No, Bill Powell, actually, the former clarinet teacher at CalArts.
Oh, okay.
But and then they needed a place to put it, and it ended up in the string studio.
Great.
Okay.
Great. Sorry,
use it for chamber
derailed. So you're playing around with that.
And I had been Vicky Ray, my colleague, had let me borrow a piano bow, and I did a bunch of recording of improvisations of bowed piano right before the campus shut down, and I was just experimenting kind of in a DAW with playing around with these recordings and also with the recordings of the wind. And there's something I've often gravitated towards kind of textural percussion sounds, things like sandpaper or just things that have kind of a grit to them, almost like a white noise type quality. And I don't know why per se, I just enjoy listening to that. And the wind feels very parallel to that. And,
I see. It's just
and
like
so
a
it
texture.
was kind of a natural way of thickening the texture of some of the percussion sounds that I was working with in the score. And I think they were in my ear because of this other project, and so they just made their way in.
So for the Yarn Wire folks, what has the bowed piano experience been like? Like, what are the challenges of this piece versus some other of stuff in your rep?
Yeah, I think, Andrew is also, a great collaborator, and he was in close touch as he was sort of developing things and asking, what's possible, what's not possible. This is what I think I'd like to do. What do you think about it? So that was really nice. I think the bowed piano thing is, as we learned, it's really kind of, maybe fickle is not the right word. It's a little finicky, and it's not the same on every piano, no matter how careful you are. But at the same time, it works very well in what Andrew's written. I think it actually, he includes a lot of possibility for unexpected things to happen in the way he uses bowed pianos, finding different harmonics in the series along the string. And sort of allowing things to speak as the piano wishes to let them speak. So I think it works.
Nice metaphor.
Yeah, it works really beautifully.
Cool.
Maybe actually, if it's okay, we do have, since we're talking about this piece, we do have a question from somebody in the audience.
Please.
And kind of coming back to this idea of field recordings. So when recording these trees, how do you go about choosing your perspective, mic placement, etc.? At what point in the process do you envision how the recordings will fit in a piece?
I usually try to find a location that's far away from other noise that might interfere. So trying to get far away from a road or something like that. You can never quite avoid getting away from planes. So those have a tendency to make an appearance no matter what. And then the challenge is when recording the wind is that you want to have the sound of the wind, but not necessarily the sound of the wind hitting the microphone. because I'm trying to record the tree, not the microphone. So I try to be a little strategic about like being near, say, the top of a ridge or something, but not on the ridge, because if you're on the ridge, you'll get a lot of the wind against the microphone itself. And then, but if you find a little rock outcrop or something that's maybe sheltered, but can still pick up the sound. And in terms of how to use the recording in music, I don't usually know that until long afterwards.
I will say when we did this piece, Andrew, we rehearsed the movements that use the field recording without the field recording at first. And, we're like kind of felt like we were just stepping through the motions. But then once we got the field recording in the mix, like everything actually just snapped into place. It was pretty magical, and yeah, just like kind of, it's so necessary, at least in Little Jimmy. So whatever, you were imagining, I feel like it worked really well, and I can't wait to hear the recording. But I know that from a, live perspective, it felt pretty good.
Are you
good?
You weren't rehearsing with it, but did you eventually like have it in your earphones as you were playing the piece?
Yeah.
How does the score link up with the recording? Like, are there, well, obviously there's not a click track or something, right? Like how do you navigate the kind of dialogue, or is it just you do your thing and the recording is this kind of static thing over?
I thought it was a smart solution, Andrew. There's a timeline, and so we're using timers in it, but at the same time we have cues within the group, so it's not like, there's the sound of a pebble and then I have to hit a rock. There's not like that low level of like synchronicity. It's very textural, and so like there's a little bit of leeway with some of the timings. But we're synced up with our timers, and the score reflects that, so we follow that.
Do you all feel as performers, like, do you hear things in what you're playing that seem to be in dialogue? And like, what is that? Like, what is the actual recording versus texture that you're playing? Kind of like, what are some of the things that are going on there?
Well,
Yeah,
Laura, you have like, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Russell.
No, you go.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, they're like, Andrew is mentioning this sort of beautiful white noise that kind of happens from the sound of the wind and the wind in the trees. And we are sort of just enhancing that, I would say, through different means of, things like Russell was saying, rocks rubbing together, or a piece of slate with a glass on it, or sandpaper being rubbed together. So get these sort of slightly different variations of that kind of texture and timbre coming from different parts of the ensemble. And I also love the bird call parts.
I was going to say the bird calls.
Oh,
Yeah.
It's very
really
messian.
lovely. Yes, absolutely.
But McIntosh, it's at the same time, it's like...
You can't call all bird calls messian, right?
No.
It's unfair to all the other. It's unfair to Beethoven. It's unfair to McIntosh. So you are imitating bird calls in things that you do, or you respond? Okay, cool.
Yeah, and it's timed out, sort of spaced out, so that we get to hear the bird calls a number of times first. I think most of the time, and so the piano is really just a sort of response to that.
What are the birds we're talking about here, Andrew?
I wish I knew. I need an ornithologist to analyze the bird calls and let me know.
I got an app for my friend Eddie, who's a composer. Eddie Davis recommended a good birding app for me, and I'm not a birding person, but I like spent a week figuring out the birds in my neighborhood, of which there are like 4 kinds, and now I'm like, okay, now I don't know what to do. So
yeah. My dad would be all over this. We should have had him on.
I tried to do that for trees. I read The Overstory. Have any of you read that book? It's amazing. Oh, Andrew McIntosh. Yeah, it's about trees. It's by Richard Powers. It's like an amazing book.
Yeah, I'm reading that right now.
Oh,
wow,
okay,
you're
cool.
the only
Yeah.
person that I have met who's read that book.
It's really good, Andrew. I mean, everyone should check it out. But have you all read Orfeo, his composer book? Okay, it's amazing. It's like a novel about a composer that's like, it's really good. Anyway, I tried to figure out tree stuff, and I got an app, and it was like I couldn't even figure out the tree in my backyard because, like, how do you? We're getting a little off topic. How do you figure out trees, Andrew? Like, how do you identify all these where the pines are? I mean, I guess maybe they're kind of obvious because they're rare, but
some of them are rare and some of them are very common, but they tend to grow at different elevations.
Mhm.
So that's one of the biggest
that
factors. Is you kind of know, like, oh, I'm around 7,000 feet, so that means it could be one of these 4 options.
I see. Okay.
And then the cones are one of the biggest defining factors, but some of them are very similar. And I'm no expert. I have been doing some research to try to learn. But cool. Like, for instance, ponderosa pines and Jeffrey pines are very similar in appearance, and they grow in the same locations.
Okay.
But one of them has cones that are slightly bigger, and then they smell different.
All right, good to know.
If you go stick your nose in the trunk.
Okay. I'll just sniff around, see what I can. So maybe, we've been talking about a little bit abstractly about a piece that no one who's watching this has heard yet. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about your first piece for Yarn Wire, Hyenas in the Temple of Pleasure, and maybe we can queue up a little bit of video or audio to list so the audience can get a little flavor of the sound of that piece.
Yeah. Do you have any preferences, Andrew?
Oh, what's your favorite movement?
Ooh.
All of them.
That's the classic cop-out answer, isn't it?
Good answer.
3?
4?
4?
I don't know. They're all
Let's do 4.
Yeah.
4.
Great.
All right.
Oh, I wrote in here queue up 3, but I'm happy to do 4 too.
He's good.
We'll do 3. Let's do 3.
Whatever Rob
do
has.
3.
Yeah,
ready.
yeah. You queued it. You wanted that, so let's do it.
Okay.
Here it comes.
Cool. Yeah, I really love the sound of that. I mean, that's a really basic observation to make, but just like the like texture of the bass drum and the piano. Can you talk a little bit about how you generated this movement and the material you were kind of working with?
Sure. Again, back to the idea of I tend to work on multiple pieces at the same time, and they kind of cross-pollinate. This movement had a strong influence from another piece that I had just finished called Imperfect Distance, where I was playing around with actually a very kind of stupid little game, actually, but assigning basically one finger to a key on the piano, and then giving that key its own rhythmic cycle. So like basically between
like
the two
Talia type situation?
Not necessarily. More like an
Okay.
ISO rhythm.
That's what I meant to say. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's been a while for me since that stuff, even though I'm a musicologist.
Yeah, that's fine. But you know, if you think between the two pianists, you have 20 fingers. So this finger might happen like once every 21 30-second notes, and this one happens every 22 30-second notes, and every 23 30-second notes, and so on. So all the fingers are on their own little independent rhythmic cycle, and it was just a little game. Like, what would happen if I followed this through to its logical end and made a whole chunk of music out of it? And then it felt rather static. And so eventually I start moving. Each finger moves down a half step very slowly, one at a time. So the chord kind of gradually shifts. And with the bass drum, I think, well, actually, back to that idea of the gradual shift, I think most of what I've learned about composition, I feel like I've learned as a performer from being a violinist. And at one point, I had played a lot of pieces that involved very slow glissandos, especially by Tashi Wada, whose music I love. And the thing that always strikes me about that very slow movement is that what your ear is drawn to and what you end up paying attention to is the movement itself. The fact that it's moving. But if something moves quicker, you tend to pay attention to the place it's going or the place it came from.
Right.
And so I love these processes that have very slow movement. But sometimes you can't perceive that movement unless there's a point that's fixed. Kind of like maybe you could imagine sitting in a park on a summer afternoon and looking up at the sky. And there's some clouds moving by very slowly, but you might not notice that they're moving unless there was a tree or a building that you could see them moving against. So in a way, the bass drum and the pipes kind of provide that fixed point for the harmony to kind of gradually shift against.
Cool. What is, Laura, you're the one doing this crazy series of patterns, right?
Ning and I both. Yeah.
Okay, you're both. So how does that work? Like, is it taxing?
Well, the first time that I saw it, I think I was like, oh, because it's all these really precisely noted sort of dotted 16th, 32nd note rhythms. But it's because the pitches are fixed. And after a while, you sort of just internalize this rhythmic structure that's happening. And it's actually, it ends up like, you know, a lot of things once you practice it, being really quite possible and almost natural in a way. And I think it just creates such a beautiful texture. Maybe Ning, you have other thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think another element of this movement for Laura and I were like, we were wondering, like, is this pedal marking correct? Because we're supposed to be pedaling the entire time, you know, it does. And but then in the end, it just created this really lush, ambiguous sort of like a ball of sound where you can hear the lines, and you can hear all of those rhythms and everything, but it wasn't like that. It's not intricate rhythm wasn't something that was constantly on our mind, right? It was like this really lush sound.
Yeah,
cool.
Definitely.
This piece has definitely, I feel like, one of the, maybe like in the top 20 titles of 21st century pieces. Hyenas in the Temple of Pleasure. What does the title signify? How does it relate to the music and the third movement in particular, if that's relevant?
Yeah, well, I can't claim any credit for the title. It's from a poem by the poet Brendan Constantine, who's a local poet here in LA. And when I was a grad student, I did some kind of little underground show at a poetry venue. And this is probably 2008 or something, 2007. And they had invited a couple musicians to improvise live with poets.
Oh, cool.
And you know, poets reading their own poetry. And my memory of the event is that it was a little bit of a disaster, but there was one poet that I completely fell in love with, and it's Bredin Constantine, and he just has the most wonderful way of reading. And it's a very very colorful language that he uses, and so I've just followed his work ever since, and came across this poem. At the time, it was unpublished, called "Hyenas in the Temples of Pleasure," which he took from his own kind of paraphrased translation of a little apocalyptic sounding verse from the book of Isaiah, and then wrote his own poem based on it. So in some way, this piece is a bit of a response to his poetry.
So each movement tracks with a different part of the poem?
Well, it's not that direct, because the poem is in three parts and pieces in four movements. But it's more just a kind of vague sense of the imagery being manifested in the music.
So this was your first kind of big collaboration with Yarn Wire and Little Jimmy is this follow-up. When you're working with an ensemble like Yarn Wire, do you typically kind of do the whole score and present it to them? Like at what stage of the process is there a back and forth, and what does that look like?
I don't remember as clearly with Hyenas, except I remember I had to write it fairly quickly.
I think we got the finished piece from you.
I think it was finished. Yeah.
But then there was a revision after, because originally we did it on one piano. Four hands, and now it's a two piano piece because I remember you guys like knocking into each other and everything, and then
is this like before Yarn Wire could afford two pianos? What was the situation?
Kind of.
Well, kind of.
Okay. You didn't have access to the one in Andrew's office?
Right. I mean, you need to bring that over here. No, I think maybe the concert we were doing, there was only one piano. It was like we had two in our studio, but it was like, okay, this venue, I think it was a church in Brooklyn, through Issue Project Room, they had booked it, and there was one piano. So we're like, okay, everything on this program has to be one piano. That's my recollection. And so you made it that way, but then it was clear that it would actually be better on two pianos, and so there's a revision with two pianos, and we only play at two pianos now. Yeah.
Andrew, have you learned things about writing for Yarn Wire from the first piece? And also you have a couple pieces that you've written for members of the ensemble, We See the Flying Bird and 5 songs that you have kind of brought to the newer work.
Probably subconsciously. I think the main thing I've learned from working with them is that they're just phenomenal musicians, and I absolutely love everything they do. And somehow I seem to be able to write anything, and then they play it and it sounds magical. So
it's good.
But the music you've been writing, it's been getting easier as you realize we can't execute difficult things. No, I'm joking.
Well,
we paid Andrew to say that,
Not the duo. Give me a break.
That's true. That's pretty difficult.
From your all perspective, like how do the two pieces seem to differ? Like, have you noticed a transition in Andrew's style, or any changes beyond just the use of the field recording? Or
yeah, well, I mean, I would add also that we got to know Andrew more as a person too, I think, in this whole process, between Hyenas and then the 5 songs and We See the Flying Bird, and then he was also guest faculty at our summer institute one year, so we got to spend some excellent quality time with him then. And I think in this last piece, and maybe this is just my own like personal interpretation, I do feel like there is just like a more sort of slightly more collaborative part of it in some ways, the fact that Andrew knows us. I mean, even if it wasn't direct, I guess it's indirect, like he was saying, it's subconscious. He knows our playing, he can imagine sort of what's possible. And so maybe there's like I'm really speaking for you, Andrew. I'm sorry. There's like freedom
That's
in
great.
that somehow.
Right,
Also,
right.
I remember in the process in this one, like for hyenas, you guys, I think you're right. Like we got the finished piece, and then we worked on it in rehearsal. And you know, when you get a piece from someone that you haven't worked with before, and you're kind of just getting to know them, you know, there might be a little awkward thing, and you're like, oh, what does this mean? Oh, how do we do this? You know, and you can only work on it in rehearsal. But in Little Jimmy, Andrew reached out even before the piece was written with sketches with ideas, and that didn't happen with hyenas. You know, and it was just like, how's this sound? Does this sound good? Blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, I gave him a hard time for starting one of the movements with a quarter note rest. And yes, it's made it into this. And you know, I could joke with him on that.
Why were you upset about that?
Oh, it's just a little joke that we had in that, like, you know, he sent a sketch and I said, don't do that, because when we start it, we're going to start on when we actually play, not that. And, you know, that's not the sort of joking
It's
around.
Beethoven 5 problem. But,
Yeah. But that's not the sort of joking around you would do unless, like, you know,
you knew them. Yeah,
you can do that. So that was really great.
Cool. Maybe let's talk a little bit about the two other works, which are for subsets of Yarn Wire. Is that right? We See the Flying Bird and 5 songs. Yeah, maybe let's cue something up. Should we listen to a little bit of? Anyone have a preference?
Let's do Flying Bird.
Great.
Is that cool? Yeah, we'll go from the top. Nice. I hate to jump in, but we actually have a couple questions.
Oh, please, yes.
They're referred to the other piece, and so the first one is from Alex, and Alex asks, "What differences do you notice among the various pine sounds, and will they all be part of one piece?"
Yeah, I don't know the answer to whether or not they'll all be part of one piece. I'm still thinking about that. I tend to work very slowly, so we might not have an answer to that question for a year or two. But in terms of them sounding different, what I found is that generally at lower elevations, pine trees tend to have very long, floppy needles, and those have a certain kind of silvery, wispy sound to them, with a kind of texture that's hard to describe. And as you go higher in elevation, the needles get shorter and shorter and shorter, and the sound becomes much more focused. And so what I notice is that the trees with the longest needles create more of an overall texture. And then at the highest elevations, like the bristlecone pines with the tiny short needles, what you hear is more of the movement, because the sound is very focused and it's in a way has more of a location. So you hear it passing from left to right much more. But I can't say that I can actually identify 18 different sounds from the 18 different trees. I think
at the end of it, maybe, though, right?
Factors like how windy is it, and what time of year or what time of day, or how tall is the tree, or is there a bunch of them mixed in together in one forest? All of these things make it very much not a scientific process.
Nice. The other question is from Christopher, and Christopher asks, will you return to the places that burned to record sounds again? And how might sounds from those places now be used or influence your composition compared to before those fires happened?
I've thought about that. I mean, I won't return to them before the area is open. So like Little Jimmy opens on April 1st of 2022.
Wow.
At least if the current forest order holds. I will probably go back and see, but I have no idea what I'll find, so I won't know the answer to what I would do with the sound until I know what it sounds like.
With like the way that you approach this process, most of the kinds of words you've used to describe and kind of frame your experience in these field recordings is to focus on sound, like talking about the specific kinds of sounds you hear and the environment. Is there an emotional component for you for the recording experience? And also like I mean, if I found out that this forest burned down, I would be pretty angry. Like, and there's not a lot of places to put that anger. Like, how do you kind of reckon with that as a musician?
Oh yeah, certainly there's a lot of emotion that goes into it. With music, I'm not always convinced that the emotion you put into something though is the same as the emotion that comes out of it.
That's interesting.
And so I think that's why I tend to not use that terminology as much. And emotions are complex. Like in Little Jimmy, yes, there's definitely anger that goes into it, but there's also, feelings of thinking about resilience, or thinking about like the way that this is part of a natural process of the planet on some level, and that cyclical nature of it.
Do you think of it in that like, do you see your music in a piece like that being a reflection of your own feelings about a kind of natural environment, or do you want it to be a kind of removed from human resilience growth, focused on the environment? If that makes sense. That might be a too heady of a question.
No, and I'm not looking for anything to be removed from feelings or emotion. It's like maybe if actually I can steer this back towards the percussion duo we just listened to. And that for me, there's definitely feeling and emotion that's involved in that opening of that piece. I would have a hard time describing what that is.
Mm-hmm.
And so much easier to talk about is to say that it started from a place of curiosity. It's just sort of in answer to the question of what would happen if I asked two vibraphone players to play in unison with the motors at different speeds. It's kind of a stupid question. It's a very dry question. There's not much emotion in that.
But if you ask it a little question, you can get, I mean, that's like a kind of like process music thing, right? You take something little and you end up getting all this other stuff out of it, right?
Yeah, and I think what happens is that a question like that, it sends you on a path.
Hmm.
and then things happen on that path, and sometimes those things are emotional, and I think that's I tend to gravitate towards those. But again, I don't really believe in any kind of universal language in music. So I think that like I might experience something as being joyful,
Mhm.
and I might share it, and someone else will listen to it and say like, "Oh, it's so sad," which I've definitely had that happen before. And so I think that makes it very hard to say like this music has this message, or this music has
Right.
this emotion, unless the music actually has words.
Right. Cool. Yeah, maybe that's a good. It looks like we're coming up on 4. That's when we wrap up, 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
any other thoughts that Andrew or the other folks from the ensemble want to share?
If you haven't heard it, check out this music. I love
Yes.
it. So
Yeah, it's really
that's the
special
only-
stuff.
My only thought.
And check out
Yeah.
Andrew's playing too, with as a soloist and with Formalist Quartet. Yeah.
For sure.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. This was a real pleasure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks so
well.
much, Will, and thanks, Andrew. Thanks for joining us. Our next and last episode of 2020 is tomorrow,
Ooh.
Friday, December 18th. We're going to be talking with composer Misato Mochizuki and conductor Ilan Volkov. And disclaimer, we've already recorded this one because of the time differences. But we will still be in the chat, so if anyone has questions, you can always reach us there. We'll be watching along with you. Lastly, as many organizations are doing at this time of year, we're in the midst of a end-of-year fundraising campaign. And so if you liked what you've been seeing over the fall and winter, you can always support this project by visiting patreon.com to dig a little bit deeper. Or you can always go to our website and donate there. And thanks for all your support. Thanks for watching, and thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Will, for
Thank
bringing
you.
us back to this music. It's really a pleasure.
Thank
Great.
you all
Thank you so
much.
much.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.